Well, thanks for joining us. I'm Major Garrett, Chief White House Correspondent, CBS News. It's great to have you all with us. We have a fantastic panel. I'm not going to bore you with introductions. That's what Google's for. But we have an excellent panel. These are all very candid, experienced legislators. I've covered them, know all four of them very well, so let's get started. First of all, I just want to thank the President for having a press conference this morning while I was flying here to Los Angeles. That always makes me really happy. But I'll pick up on one thing the President said, and I want to throw it out to all four of you, just as an introductory remark. The President said there will be glitches and bumps in the road in the implementation of his health care law. That's both a political reality he's probably for the first time acknowledged, and it may be one that has real-life effects to Americans. So, starting with you, Senator Warner, as a Democrat, as someone who will see this play out in your state and nationally, do you think there'll be more than glitches involved with the implementation of the President's health care law, and is that a big problem politically for Democrats?
I think it's too early to tell. I think clearly when you make this kind of change in the basic underlying delivery of health care, there will be glitches. I think as well the fact that everything was kind of held in hiatus a bit to see if what the Supreme Court would do or not do slowed down the implementation. But with all of those challenges, I would still point to the fact that one of the good signs, and we could debate whether it's all due to the health care reform, but if you go back to where the projections were in 2010 in terms of the rise of health care, particularly the rise of Medicare costs, that rate of increase has come down fairly dramatically in the last 3 years. Now, is it Obamacare? Is it the recession? Is it the fact that healthcare industry is starting to change delivery? But net, the CBO projections now have us saving about $500 billion over 10 years off of healthcare-related costs of the government since 2010. So I think we're headed in the right direction. I hope we don't end up in the implementation phase setting us back, but long term, I think it was still the right direction to head.
Senator, your Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, has called on the President to give something like a national address about the implementation of health care law, what it's going to mean, what its consequences are. That tells me he thinks it's going to be a net negative for the President and Democrats.
Well, this may be evidence that you develop your opinions based upon your perspective. From where you come from, in my view, glitches is too modest of a word. I think there are significant challenges, difficulties in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. I think the costs associated with the Affordable Care Act, I'm the ranking Republican on the subcommittee that has appropriations for the Department of Health and Human Services. The Affordable Care Act is within our jurisdiction. Billions of dollars more necessary for its implementation within the President's budget request. And just listening to Americans, particularly Kansans at home, great uncertainty about what it means, how can we afford it. Talking to business men and women who are making decisions about how to reduce the size of their workforce and how to make certain that people who are part-time under the definition of the Affordable Care Act. So I think what's happened is that, at least politically, the benefits that were perceived to arrive from the Affordable Care Act, which would be you're on your parents' plan until age 26, the idea of covering pre-existing conditions, those are very appealing to Americans. And I think now you see in coming into the next political season, the more difficult, the more onerous aspects of the Affordable Care Act. So I think the challenges are real, and from a person who comes from a very rural state, the ability for our providers, for there to be a sufficient number of providers who will now accept the reimbursement rate that comes from the exchanges or from Medicare. Fewer and fewer providers are going to be there. We don't have the physicians who are going to be in place to take care of the needs.
Congresswoman, your chamber under Republican leadership is responsible for about, I think, 44 votes to appeal the President's health care law. The White House frequently reminds those of us.
Do you know that we want to repeal this law?
Apparently so, yes. And yet your leadership is sort of struggling internally now with another go-around on that. Are the politics shifting within your own conference on this? And do you see implementation as a big problem? And I guarantee you, Senator Casey, you're going to get ample time to respond, because I know you want to.
Well, we recognize that we need health care reform in this country. We need to take steps to ensure that people have access to quality and affordable health care. The early signs are that this law has created a lot of questions. Similar to Senator Moran, when I go home, this is the #1 question that people are asking me. It doesn't matter what the meeting is, what the group that is gathered, whether they're individuals, families, businesses, providers, just a lot of uncertainty. And this week, or I guess it was last week, for example, on the high-risk pool, and this was one of the signature, this is one of the areas that was touted the most by the president, was the fact that there was going to be a mandate for those who have pre-existing conditions that they would have access to this federal high-risk pool, and yet it's already reached its max. They've signed up the people, and they're not going to sign up anymore. And the Republicans in the House were ready to take some action. We're still working on getting the votes.
Yes, you are.
But there is a recognition that there's all year long there's going to be some specific dates, and that unfortunately the administration has missed the deadlines, and in order for people to make decisions, they need that certainty that comes with the administration issuing the rules.
To pick up on that point, if Kathleen Sebelius were here, she is the head of Health and Human Services, former insurance commissioner of the state of Kansas, she would say, yes, we're trying to go slowly because if we go too rapidly and we meet arbitrary deadlines, we won't have all that needs to be in place to meet the standards set by the law. So give us a bit of time. Senator Casey, do you think that's a fair response? And what's your overall take on implementation and the political backdrop as this law becomes more real?
Well, I'd say first that if you voted for it like I did, you damn well better be committed to getting it right and getting it implemented well, number one. I think there are a number of challenges. I think what the president, I saw that part of his news conference, but the point that he made about the 85 to 90% of Americans who have coverage and whose coverage now is strengthened, and some folks who wouldn't have the protection they're getting today. I mean, some of the numbers are extraordinary. 100 million people have gotten preventative care, if you include seniors and everyone. 17 million children with pre-existing conditions have coverage and protection. No one that I know of, no one I've run to, even in Washington, wants to go back to the days when a child with a pre-existing condition is somehow denied coverage or treatment. The other number, which is startling, is the number of seniors. I want to say it's a little more than 6 million seniors have gotten about $6 billion in savings. So the positive features of it are working, they're popular, I think they're a sign of real progress. But I have to say, one thing the president didn't mention, which I thought he should have today, was the concern that small businesses have. I run into that a lot in Pennsylvania. And I think it is, I don't think we should see it in isolation, that somehow it's solely a concern or an anxiety or an uncertainty about health care. It is infused with a tough, the nature of the tough economy. And I think for a small business owner who doesn't have enough certainty or sense of where the tax code might be in a couple of years, has some uncertainty about health care, and has some other anxieties, I think it makes for a pretty difficult set of circumstances. So anything we can do in a bipartisan way to kind of lower the temperature on this issue would be of great value.
While I button up this one particular issue, I want to ask all four of you a frontline political question. 2014 is not going to be a referendum on the president's health care law. Midterm elections rarely factor out that way. 2016 will be. There was a mini referendum in 2012. The president was reelected. People embraced that. By 2016, and I'll start with you, Senator Warner, do you think the health care law will be not only something that will be well implemented, but be a political asset in a long running run for the Democratic Party, or a liability?
I obviously think it's going to be a net positive. I think the challenge will still be, are we going to be really moving away from a fee-for-service model? You can't provide fee-for-service model in healthcare with an aging population, increasing medical technology. It is a recipe for financial ruin. I would agree with Bob as well, though, that there are lots of problems in the Affordable Care Act.
Do you see the small business concern?
I see the
Commonwealth
small
of
business
Virginia?
concern. I still think there's going to be some working out in terms of, when there had to be some kind of arbitrary cut line on how many employees you have before you have coverage. There will be challenges. What I wish we would have, whether it's the Affordable Care Act or whether it's Dodd-Frank, something I was very involved in, that we'd have a kind of an attitude that said, all right, we've had a bill passed, we've had a Supreme Court case, we've had a presidential election, revalidating it. Now let's go in and actually fix what's wrong with this, as opposed to this kind of, I think, rather non-productive of No, it's repeal or nothing.
Well, let me stop you there,
Which,
because
to me,
Republicans
is
would say, and
bad
correct me
business.
if I'm wrong, Senator Moran, that when something is rammed down your throat or perceived to be rammed down your throat, you're not as interested in fixing it at the margins.
I think Mark raises a good point, and in the sense that Dodd-Frank is a perfect example. I serve on the banking committee.
That's the financial restructuring
Yes, thank you.
reform legislation.
I'm not trying to change the subject, but it's the experience that I've had in the United States Senate. We have lots of hearings looking at what's wrong with Dodd-Frank or what's right with Dodd-Frank, and then nothing ever follows. We spend a lot of time taking in input, but never a hearing, never a markup, what we call a markup, to have amendments, debate, and pass a bill, because it seems to me that the sides are so far apart that everyone's worried that if you change even this bill modestly, and it's true in regard to health care, if you start trying to fix the problems,
You begin to
then it
unravel.
all falls apart. Then you can't do it in a modest way because of the diversity of opinions about the
So
need
by
for
2016,
legislation.
you expect your party to be running hard and hard against this and saying in no uncertain terms or briefly, we told you so.
You know, I'm involved in the Senate races for 2014. I think that elections are about states and local and
But by
whether you're
2016,
perceived.
it'll be different.
But in 2016, but I think actually health care will be an issue in 2014. I think it has the potential of this phase we're going through in which there's so much uncertainty and such difficulty that health care becomes a topic of conversation in 2014. 2016 is a long time away, but I can't imagine
Enough to
this issue
change the
goes away.
majority in 2014?
We have the opportunity to change the majority. It all depends on how we behave and what we do.
A big issue in 2016? Centerpiece?
I see it more as a big issue in 2014. When you look at the House races and what we're facing in 2014, all year long there's going to be more and more issues related to health care reform. We've already seen the effort to repeal the medical device tax, for example, has large majorities in the House and the Senate to do so. The pre-existing condition with the high-risk pool, employers are and individuals are seeing some pretty hefty premium increases, 50% on average. Waiting lists to get a doctor that will take a Medicare patient. A fear that many more are going to be losing their employer-offered health insurance. And all year long, as we get, October 1st is a big deadline where the exchanges are to be in place at the state level. And right now we have a third of the states who are moving forward with exchanges, a third that are saying, no, we're not going to put in an exchange, and a third that are waiting to see what the federal government comes up with. And I think all of this is going to create a lot of concern, and I think it's going to keep healthcare on the forefront of the debate heading into the 2014 election.
Politics, Senator Casey. How's it going to shake out?
First of all, I want to say I love Jerry, but I really feel badly he's got to run a campaign committee.
Thank you very much.
Every time I see him, I have pity for him because he's a good guy, and now he's got to just go around the country and raise money. But we're
Like
This
the
is
rest of us
because you guys never do that on your own, right?
oh, but Jerry has to do it for thousands of people.
Mark Warner is up in 2014.
So,
No, but
politics.
it's hard to predict. But I think 16 will
No,
be
but you have a gut instinct. I know it's hard to predict, but you have a gut instinct.
much more, I think, about the broader economy than just healthcare. But I will say this: I think there has been.
So you don't think healthcare will be a cutting issue 2014 or even 2016?
Oh no, I think it'll be an issue, but I think it's still
And
going
this
to be back
healthcare law will be a problem.
to
You
jobs
don't
and
think
debt.
so? Okay.
Yeah, more so. But let me just make a comment on where we've been. Despite all the rancor and division, there actually has been a few moments when people came together to change the legislation. One was the Congresswoman just mentioned one on medical device tax. That was a rather significant moment. But we had a 1099 issue early on. We had a couple of issues like that where I think folks can come together, because if you're in the two extreme caucuses, repeal it now and forget about it, that's not acceptable to anybody, or at least anybody who cares about the country and the economy. The other caucus of it's perfect, don't touch it, we passed it, that's not a very good caucus to be in either. So I think there are places we can come together.
All right, let's talk about immigration real quick, and I'll start with you, Senator Casey. I want to ask a threshold question off the top. We'll get in a little bit more detail in a minute. It's my sense, and the White House believes, that there are 65 to 70 votes for the Gang of Eights proposal. Do you believe that?
I don't know what that vote total is, but I think we have enough to pass it. Hard to tell.
And withstand a filibuster challenge should it come?
Yes. Because look, this is an issue where no matter where you land on the particulars of the bill, everyone knows we've got a system that's broken and it needs to be fixed.
So enough to get over a filibuster and maybe as high as 70 under the best case.
I hope that momentum would help in the House.
Well, which I'll bring back to in just a second. Do you agree with that? Do you think 65 or 70?
I'm not a vote counter. That 70 seems high to me, but it's relatively new. And my guess is, not my guess, the reality will be that bill will undergo significant opportunities for amendment in the committee and on the floor, and it becomes a different bill than what the Gang of Eight has created. So I think it's yet to be determined. I think there's what Bob said is true. There's a real understanding on the part of Republicans and Democrats that our immigration system is broken. It fails to meet the country's needs. Certainly economically, it fails to meet the country's needs. My staff in Kansas, what we call casework, will spend more time trying to solve people's problems with immigration than almost anything else we do. And it's the system is broken, and there's a file for this person, and it's stuck on somebody's desk in Lincoln, Nebraska, and it's been there for a decade. There's a real recognition from a humane point of view and from an economic point of view that this system needs to be fixed.
So this gets over the 60 vote threshold from your vantage point.
I don't know enough to predict the number of votes we've had.
That wouldn't surprise you, though.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Senator Warner?
Yeah, I think candidly it'd be an embarrassment if we didn't get 70 votes on this.
It'd be an embarrassment.
It'd be an embarrassment. I mean, and I actually, listen, Jerry and I worked together for the last couple of years on the high skill component. I see Steve Case in the audience. He's been a great partner with us on trying to change the absolutely insane current policies we have.
With H-1B.
Not just we didn't focus as much on H-1B, although that's a component part, but the fact that we train the world's best and brightest, particularly in the STEM fields, with graduate degrees, and then we either send them home or send them to Canada that changed its immigration laws to take those. Or if you're even here on an H-1B and you want to be an entrepreneur and start a business, and we've got a lot of work that Jerry and I have done on helping start entrepreneurial businesses, which again this conference reflects as well, needs to have that opportunity to do it here in America. I think there's enormous investment made in increasing border security. I think there's enormous investment made as well in making sure we'll have a system where we actually not only track people coming into the country, but leaving the country. So if we can't come together on this issue, which is in our national security, which is enormously in our economic interests, which the business community needs to get off their duffs and not weigh in a little way, but weigh in a major way, and I think deals in a respectable way with the close to 11 million undocumented, giving those folks a path to earn the right to stay here, then shame on us. And it won't be, I know there are some who say, well, let's do it in piecemeal approaches. That is simply code for let's not do immigration reform. So we're going to see whether the country will step up.
Which is a perfect segue to get to Congresswoman Morris Rogers, because two realities now sit before you. One, you have 3 senators, very capable, though Terry doesn't say he's a vote counter. He knows his instincts are as good as anyone's. 60 or more means it's coming your way. We don't know what the vote is, but it's going to be more than 60. It's coming your way. The relevant committee chairman and the speaker have hinted they would prefer to do something at a piecemeal basis. Senator Warner just said that's code for killing the bill.
Right.
What are the politics and what are the legislative approaches the House Republicans are going to take, because you are going to get this bill and you're going to get it probably by July. And then the eyes of the country, not to mention the White House and the Senate, will be upon you.
And the House, too, is committed to immigration reform. We may not approach it the same way. We may.
But why isn't piecemeal code for killing it?
Because piecemeal is maybe the way that we can get important parts of immigration reform, a guest worker program, the visa, the E-Verify. We can get these pieces through the House and ultimately get us to conference committee, which we're going to need to be, and work out a comprehensive immigration reform package. There's a recognition in the House that ultimately it will be a comprehensive package. It is how we get there. And the Speaker, several years ago, actually tasked a group in the House, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, to start working on comprehensive immigration reform. And I've talked with Democratic and Republican members, and they believe that they are 80, 90% of the way there. the dynamics are a little different in the House than the Senate, in that when you get 8 members in the House, even to agree, it doesn't mean that you're going to get the 218 votes that you need. So in the House, I think it's important that we're working through this process where the committees do have the hearings and work through some of these issues, and that may be the way that we find success in the House. And our chairman, Bob Goodlatte, has committed first week in May, he's going to start working on the guest worker program, for example, and get something out of the committee so that we can start the process in the House, and we're very much committed. I believe we need immigration reform in this country for the reasons that have been laid out. There's economic reasons, there's national security reasons. America has been this great land of immigrants and people that have come here from every corner of the world, and we want that to continue.
And I don't
Major,
want to.
can I respond
Yeah, sure,
to two
please.
things that I've heard?
Yep.
One, I think piecemeal may actually be an option. I've heard among the Gang of 8, there is a sense that there are 60 votes for various components of the overall legislation, and it may be a different 60 set of senators voting for a component.
Undoubtedly.
So that's a possibility that's necessary to put it, and I think it's what's being described by Kathy in the House. The other point, that when you asked me to tell you whether it gets 60 votes, let me make this caveat, and I've not seen evidence of this, but I have had this concern that Democrat strategists may decide this is an issue that they want to keep around lingering into the election. And if that's the case, I mean, the concern I would have politically is that there may be Democrat strategists, neither one of my colleagues here fit that criteria, but they decide that why don't we raise the bar and create a bill that Republicans can't or won't support. And so
Now, let me pick up on that point, because when President Obama went to your conference, met privately,
Yes.
these things tend to leak out even in private meetings. So I'm only telling you something
You
you've
knew
already
about
heard
that,
from the
huh?
president. No, I know about the meeting, but I also know what he told you about immigration reform. He said exactly, he took up that issue. He said, if I wanted, I'm doing you a favor. Those are almost his precise words. I'm doing you a favor by pushing immigration reform, because if I were really opposed to you, I would keep it around your neck for the next 2.5 years. And the president, there are component parts of the Gang of 8 bill the president does not support, and there are things in it that don't exist that he wishes were in it.
And Major, I would simply add in this point, I know the 4 Republican members of the Gang of 8 pretty well. I don't think any of them are tools of Democratic strategists. So I think this bill's not perfect, but as I looked at it,
So
drilling down on pieces.
So the president thinks he's doing Republicans a favor. You are still skeptical, though, right?
I just raised that topic when you asked us to count votes. This is a long process yet to be seen. And there is
And the
still-
politics
and-
haven't been tested in committee or on the floor, and until
Correct.
they are, no one knows.
Right.
Okay. We just had a piece of legislation, I believe it's going to be signed by the president this afternoon, alleviating the FAA disruptions under sequestration. It's one of those odd words. Sequester is the verb, sequestration is the noun, but they sound just like the opposites. We always use them incorrectly. I finally looked that up the other day. But the FAA component is now alleviated. It's now lifted. I know Senator Warner thinks that was a terrible idea. I'll get to the reasons why in a second. But for you, Congresswoman, are you satisfied with the FAA resolution? And do you believe it is now, and the White House has sort of agreed that it's a model for resolving things under these automatic across-the-board spending cuts?
There was a lot of concern of the way that the FAA chose to implement sequestration. In years past, air traffic controllers have always been deemed essential employees. And the way that they chose to implement sequestration was wreaking havoc. It was impacting us economically. And the Republicans believed that there were other choices that they could have made. And we were pleased that they were willing to agree that the flexibility was the key. And we're willing to give the flexibility to the agencies so that they can set priorities, but that we can have this goal of actually bringing down federal government spending.
Senator Warner, the White House said, I was at many, many briefings. I listened to Jay Carney tell me once, I heard him tell me 1,000 times, revenue needs to be attached to any fix to sequestration, and no temporary Band-Aid solutions. And now, for all the world to see, there's no revenue attached to this, and it's a temporary Band-Aid solution? Is that a tactical retreat for the White House? And what
What I
so
think-
what are the consequences?
What I said earlier was I think if you're going to go down a path, I say this is a former governor who, with our budget crisis, had to cut across the board, shut down DMVs, Department of Motor Vehicles, got everybody in the whole state mattering the heck at me. But it made the point, and I actually would not completely agree with your characterization in my view. I don't think air traffic controllers and the traveling public should be held out as particular scapegoats. But the notion that we can Band-Aid one problem after another, if there's going to be the same eruption from the public when, hundreds of thousands of kids are put off a Head Start, or when cancer research from the NIH, which is done in sometimes 4 and 5 year increments, that the first 4 years of research is done, the 5th year contract can't be let, and we have to flush the previous research, or when we start violating multi-purchase contracts that the government buys because we can't enter into the next year of the contract, I hope we arise with the same kind of amount of uproar. My fear is we're not. The problem with sequestration, it was set up to be so stupid that no rational group of people would ever let it happen. Which may be a
Purely Washington.
partial indictment of all of us.
Pure Washington creation there.
But at the end of the day, we are on a path. Let's just take, I know I want to make sure everybody gets a chance on this, but this is the one I'm the most obsessed with.
This is your lane.
This is my lane. Remember, we are on a path with the House approach, and actually there's blame on both sides, so maybe equal opportunity on this. But domestic discretionary spending right now is about 16% of our budget. In English, that means education, infrastructure, R&D, airports, energy. The House approach would take that 16% down to about 4% over 15 years. No business person in this group would ever invest in a business that spent less than 5% of its revenues on staying competitive. Education of its workforce, infrastructure to compete, and R&D to stay ahead. Yet that's the path. Now, I believe it's going to have to take additional revenues, and I also believe it's going to have to take changes in our entitlement programs. Instead, we're defaulting to that ever smaller piece of discretionary spending, domestic and defense, to take chop after chop after chop. That is not a rational way for America to stay competitive in the 21st century. And and sequestration, I just again will hope that we will raise the same furor over all these other changes that in many ways are more insidious and will do more long-term damage, research being flushed, taxpayer dollars being wasted on breaking contracts, and I hope it gets the same attention.
So if I can paraphrase Senator Warner, Senator Moran, he doesn't want flexible stupidity.
No, I think we should
the
never let
flexibility is
sequestration
not an
go first.
answer.
I actually voted for the Republican plan. If we didn't have a Democratic plan, I said let's give the president at least flexibility to manage it better. I voted for both, but I think that it begs the bigger question that says sequestration as a tool on fixing our budget, I fundamentally believe is an enormously flawed policy that will hurt America's recovery and long-term damage our ability to compete.
Right.
Until and unless we deal with revenues and entitlements, we are simply dancing around the problem.
First of all, Major, I didn't vote for sequestration, so I'm not here to defend it. I think across-the-board cuts are that irresponsible position in which good programs and bad programs are treated equally. We ought to be setting, I'm a member of the Appropriations Committee, we ought to establish what the overall spending levels are. The Appropriations Committee ought to do its work and figure out what our priorities are. What do we want? What do we need? Having said that, I think the ability to reduce spending by $85 billion out of the size and scope of the budget that we have is doable. It ought not be done in the way that we're doing it with the across-the-board cuts, and an administration ought to have the flexibility. In fact, it amazes me it doesn't seem this administration wants the flexibility. In fact, the president the administration issued a statement indicating that the flexibility that Mark voted for was something the president would veto. Never in my life would I expect any administration not to want more ability to make decisions, not less. I got started down this issue on the announcement of 149 air traffic control towers being closed. That made no sense to me, and so I offered an amendment to the continuing resolution to take $50 million out of unencumbered balances. Mark is a supporter of that. Bob very well may have been. It had more Democrat support than Republican, although a third of the Senate sponsored the amendment and could never get a vote on it. What we did was what we tried to do was take $50 million out of unspent money, unencumbered balances is what the word is, and it was never allowed to come to a vote. I finally got the Secretary of Transportation, soon to be the former Secretary of Transportation, on the phone and said, Mr. Secretary, if you'd weigh in, this would be helpful to me. I think I can get this amendment passed and we can keep control towers in business. The answer was, I'd like to help, Jerry, but the administration opposes your amendment. That makes no sense to me. We ought to be able to, we're in the circumstance that we're in, we ought to be all in the position of trying to solve the problems. Mark raises the much broader issue, which I agree with. You cannot balance the books. You can't get us out of the fiscal condition that we're in if we only deal with the discretionary spending that the Appropriations Committee deals with on an annual basis. In some fashion, we have got to get to the broader picture. I have no doubt that what the administration believed, that if sequestration was easy, that Republicans and others might be back saying, well, if you can cut $85 billion, why not cut $185 billion? So I think there was a political game afoot here trying to prove a point that sequestration is a bad deal. And whether or not sequestration is a bad deal or not, and again, I didn't support it, but I would say we ought to try to fix the problems as we see them, even if it is a Band-Aid approach. How do you complain about Band-Aid approaches in a Congress that can't pass a budget, in a Congress that hasn't passed an appropriation bill in years and does continuing resolutions, that does a doctor fix now at 6 months at a time? When did the standard become, well, we can't fix something because it's only a Band-Aid? My gosh, that's the methodology which we've been using now for the last several years. We do Band-Aids, and we'd have to do Band-Aids. It's a terrible form of the way to operate, but it's the reality of what we do to get things done now.
Just for clarification, doc fix does not require any surgical intervention. It details the sustainable growth rate. It's a complicated thing, but I'll pick up on your point because I know, Senator Casey, you want to weigh in on this at a couple levels.
Yeah.
First of all, on the across-the-board spending cuts, but also, to pick up on Senator Warner's point, the president has in his budget something he's never had before, that no Democrat in the modern era of budgeting politics has ever called for: a technical change in the allocation of future benefits under Social Security through what is called superlative or change CPI, an adjustment in the consumer price index and how much it provides on a monthly basis to those on fixed incomes. I know you oppose that. That's represented by the White House as proof positive that the president's willing to do something courageous on entitlement spending to at least begin to wrap his and the federal government's arms around these embedded costs. So deal with both issues if you would, be so kind.
Do I get sequestration time?
Sure. Yes, you get time for both.
No, just by way of, I could almost incorporate by reference everything that Mark said. Because look, if you start from the premise that the sequester was bad public policy, and I subscribe to that, you can try to manage it, you can make changes, but it's bad public policy. It's not going to get better anytime soon. What we should do is deal with the larger question, which everyone on this stage in one way or another has worked on, but Mark has done extraordinary work to try to bring people together to deal with the long-term fiscal challenges. Let me give you an example of why it's bad policy. Just 2 examples in Pennsylvania. If sequestration were to play out, even for the first year, it has just the defense cuts alone would have in Pennsylvania about a 78,000 job impact. About
78,000 lost jobs.
Half of them direct jobs and half of them jobs related to defense. That's one example, a big number. A smaller number, but gets at a very grave problem we have right now, which is medical research. I know Milken has done great work on this. Michael has, and so many others. The sequestration means for our state, we would lose 1,200 medical research jobs, when frankly, we're getting our tails kicked on medical research. You know, a couple of years ago, I would say, we don't want to lose our edge on strategies and research that leads to cures and treatment and healing and hope in high-paying jobs. We are losing our edge. I sat with a group of scientists at Penn about 2 months ago. It was a terribly depressing meeting. At the University of Pennsylvania is doing extraordinary work in medical research. They're telling me we're losing, they didn't even mention China. Forget China and some other, we're losing jobs to Europe in medical research. So in an area which is so connected to our economy, so connected to who we are as Americans, we're losing our edge anyway, and sequestration makes that exponentially worse. So there's a lot of reasons that you can point to in terms of bad public policy, and fixing FAA or control towers, that might marginally help, but we've got to deal with the bigger issue.
Okay, so this leads me back to the other part of the question. Senator Warner would say, others who are in the sort of budget watchdog community would say, all right, Senator, all those things are valid, but if you don't deal with the discretionary side of the budget and you don't deal with the entitlement side of the budget, then there's no resolution of these things ever. And if you are going to be adamantly opposed, as I believe you are, and other colleagues of yours in the Democratic caucus and the Senate are, to something that is just at the leading incremental edge of entitlement reform, like change CPI, then you can't get to these larger issues of changing retirement age, means testing, or other things. I mean, if you're unalterably opposed to that kind of change, then aren't you just basically putting the discretionary side of the budget continuously on the chopping block? Because that's where it is now.
No, because
by law, it's on the chopping
Yeah, but
block. And the only way to get it off there, according to Republicans, is to put other things on the table, like entitlements, like
Major,
change CPI.
I don't put much stock into public assertions of saying this is what we need right now, and if you don't agree to it, therefore there are lots of ways to get here. And there's no question that we can get there. No one in their right mind a couple months ago was saying we could do immigration reform. That's likely. No one.
Right, but the president has put change CPI in the budget.
Absolutely, and that's one of.
Why do you
that's one
oppose
of
it? Why is it
several-
a bad idea?
Because of the impact that it would have on vulnerable people in my state, folks who especially veterans and middle-income families mostly. But that doesn't foreclose the possibility of having an altered version of that people can agree on. I don't think this comes down to that everything is resting on one policy prescription. There are lots of ways to get there, and I think there's a willingness within our own caucus. Mark can tell you, we had one day, I won't mention their names, 2 individuals who would be considered as left as you can get, having an argument, I won't say their names, having an argument about how we deal with long-term costs. And look, if those arguments are happening in our caucus with one wing of our caucus, that means that there's a way to get people together. But we have to do more of what Mark's been trying to do, which is to get people in a room over time, figuratively speaking, but I think we can get people together and do this. And to say that it's resting on a yes or no answer to one policy prescription, I think is really misleading.
Let me, before we go, bring up gun control. Is that issue yes or no, and then we'll delve into it a little bit more deeply in our remaining few minutes. Is that issue dead in the Senate for this year in this Congress, Senator Warner?
No, I think background checks will be brought back.
And why? And what will be different the second time after everyone has walked the gauntlet politically the first time?
Well, I think that, frankly, as somebody who's been a big Second Amendment supporter, but after Newtown feel like gun purchases that are made at gun shows ought to be held to the same standards as being purchased at a gun shop. I think they, particularly when Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey stepped in,
Right.
who no one could think either of those 2 senators are going to take away your shotgun, and crafted, I think, again, a pretty darn good piece of work. And I believe that the assumption might be that the folks who are in favor of more background checks would kind of, if it was lost, they would move on to the next issue. That usually Second Amendment supporters are louder, more strident, and more forceful in their view.
Right.
But I have to just tell you, I can only give my own personal reaction in terms of what I've seen in Virginia and traveling. I don't think people are going to move on. And I think they're going to demand that we bring it back up, and I hope that it...
To press you on that for just a moment, you know that in the Senate, more Democrats voted for the Grassley alternative than voted for Manchin-Toomey. I mean, the one that had nothing or much less on. There were
I don't
yes.
think that's it. Well, I didn't vote for the Grassley alternative, so I don't know.
But more Democrats did, and there are Democrats up in 2014.
I don't think that could have been numerically possible, since Grassley didn't get close to 60, and if Grassley got all the Republicans, if he'd had more Democrats, since 51 Democrats voted for it, along with the Republicans, that would have put him at a large majority. So I don't think the math doesn't work.
I'll go back and look. But there's no question the president didn't get the support he wanted from Democrats on that issue. And 2014 was a huge part of that calculation. Do you think any of those Democrats who voted the first way are going to change their mind in this political environment?
I think there,
You think Republicans will, in other words?
I think there may be some, again, I think it's going to be a question. I think the work that Pat Toomey and Joe Manchin did was good work. If there are legitimate concerns with that work that can still get us to then 60, so be it. But I also think it will be a question of whether, what is at least portrayed as the overwhelming majority of Americans who would like to see, a reasonable background check. We're only talking about, in effect, continuing the law for purchases, and there's an exemption for passing on in family, firearms in families, and a fairly broad exemption, again, I think that made me and others more comfortable. It's going to are the vast majority of Americans going to stay silent on this or let their voices be heard?
Senator Toomey said after the vote, it's time to move on. Do you think this issue comes back?
I doubt it.
And are you
comes back
eager for
all-
it to come back as someone who is trying to encourage a substantial change in the alignment of the United States Senate?
I was going to say,
Republicans?
my best guess is that that Democrat leadership, based upon input from Democrat senators, would not like this issue front and center again.
And there's no way for it not to be front and center if it's brought back up.
There's no way for it not to. No, if it's brought back up, it's front and center. I also would say that, this is a significant issue of public safety. We had the death of Americans. This is a serious issue that needs attention. It is something that needs to be addressed, and there is still hope out there, particularly dealing with the issue of mental illness and that aspect of this issue. There's still a hope on my part and others that that's a topic of conversation, and ultimately a legislative fix if there is one that makes sense, that makes a difference. But I would guess that politically, there's not a lot of desire among Democrats who are up for election in 2014 to have gun control on the Senate floor again.
Congressman, if it had passed the Senate, and I know that's hypothetical, no politician likes hypotheticals, but if it had passed, what would its prospects have been in the Senate? And do you think recognition that its prospects would have been so dim in the House that Senate Democrats who might have been inclined to support it if they thought this was a live wire and a real deal said, I'm not going to walk the plank for something that has no chance in the House?
Well, first, as a mom, I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, and Newtown still weighs on my mind. Every morning when I wave goodbye to Cole on the school bus, I'm thinking about him going to school and whether he's going to be safe. And I think for a lot of Americans, it still weighs on our minds. And it is important that we are taking action to do what we can to prevent these kind of situations. And the House, the Speaker had made it very clear that we were ready to review whatever passed the Senate. We have in the House, we have a Representative Tim Murphy, who's a child psychologist. He's been really looking at the mental health system. He's the chairman of the Oversight Committee that has jurisdiction, and I think he's the perfect person to take the lead. We've all heard the stories of parents who have children who they know need help, and yet they're told that there's nothing for them until their child actually commits a crime and then gets into the criminal system. And so we're looking at the mental health system. We're also looking at the reauthorization of it's the NICS, it's the National Instant Criminal System, it's the background check, and it's a partnership between the federal government and the states.
That also needs money. Both the things
Yes.
you just mentioned, the criminal background check system, which was expanded after Virginia Tech, authorized but not funded to its fullest extent, and any mental health intervention would require federal funds, at least in
Right.
cooperation with state governments.
Right.
I don't see any effort within the context we're talking about across-the-board spending cuts to dole out more discretionary funds. So you can authorize things, but I've been around Washington a very, very long time.
Right.
And nothing is a bigger act of hypocrisy or fooling the American public to authorize something that you never actually fund.
Well,
So those are two
I
huge
agree.
issues
I
attached to
agree.
both those issues.
Well, and I absolutely agree. It starts, though, with us taking the appropriate action that's actually going to help solve problems. And then when it's a priority for spending, then we need to find the money, too. And within the federal government, yes, I believe that we need to be smarter. We need to be setting priorities. We need to be thinking of how we can deliver services more efficiently, focus on outcomes. And there's ways that we can save money. so that we can actually fund the priorities of the American people within the federal government.
Senator Casey, your thoughts. Pennsylvania has both substantially large suburban populations around Philadelphia where the gun control issue plays in a very distinct and resonant way. And then you have the rural parts of the state where it plays completely the opposite. Your state is kind of a microcosm of both sides and the tension of this issue. How do you see it? And do you imagine this issue will come back this year or next year? Or as Senator Moran projected, other Democrats will say thanks but no thanks?
Yeah, I think it will come back, and it should come back. I live in a state second highest gun ownership, or second highest NRA membership in the country, next to Texas, over 1 million hunters in our state. And I made a rather dramatic change of lanes after Newtown. And I think
Why?
What's that? Newtown, in one word. I think what happened to me, I guess as a legislator, but also as a human being, is comparable to what happened to a lot of Americans. This country will never be the same after that. When you consider not just what happened, but what could have happened. What happened in really 2 classrooms, but one where most of the carnage was, you have a high-powered rifle shooting children over and over again at close range with incredibly powerful ammunition. And you had a person who was in a state of rage and had the capacity, and I think if he had the time, I think he shot 154 bullets in 5 minutes. If had the time, would have killed hundreds of kids. If he had the time, he would have killed every, and I think that was his intention. I think the evidence will show that. So that event has I think, altered the landscape forever.
That event told you there had to be a legislative response.
Absolutely, and I just couldn't vote the way I was voting. So when it came, I voted for the background check bill. I was very happy there was a bipartisan consensus. Pat and Joe did great work on that. The problem, though, is that Newtown was about, I voted for the weapon ban and the limitation on the magazines. Newtown was about the magazines. And even if we had a great moment, which I was hoping for, in passing a background check, that would not be high five time. Let's do cartwheels for this great bipartisan moment, because we would be a long way from what we need to do on this issue. I do think that what Kathy said and Jerry about making it comprehensive is true. Look, I have no illusions. I know that the weapon got 40, the magazines got 46. We're not close on either of those. I understand that. But I do think that another shot at background checks is
40 votes on
40 votes for
assault weapons ban.
Right.
46
right.
to impose a federal limit of 10 bullets per magazine clip. Okay.
But I do think there's an opportunity to take another shot at background checks, and then over time, I think I'll finish with this. There are two, no matter what we do as legislators, I think there are two inexorable forces here at work that are going to play out over the next decade. Maybe it'll take longer. One is demographics. My daughters range in age from 16 to 24. The next generation or so is just not going to tolerate what we tolerate on this issue, number one. Number two, the other inexorable force, I think, is the electoral dynamic, where in 2014, for the first time in my lifetime at least, you're going to have a force by way of spending and television ads on the other side of this issue, whereas up to now, and I think of Pennsylvania, where folks in the 90s would vote against the position of the NRA, they had no help, no backup, no money spent. It was all kind of a one-way push. Now you're going to have not just parity, but I think in 2014 you might have something greater than parity on the side of reasonable gun restrictions. But that may not, I mean, that may take a couple of cycles to play out, but I think it's inexorable.
And that brings me to sort of the last summary question, which is, what are the forces, and you just described one on one issue, that you think are shaping or reshaping American politics? And that could be anything from the way that President Obama conducted his campaign in 2008 and 2012, with an enormous emphasis on grassroots activism, voter contact, and money, but money linked directly to that voter engagement, which was completely different than any other form of voter engagement. John Kerry essentially subcontracted that in 2004. It had never been brought in-house in sort of a proprietary data basis before. That's one component that things have changed. Super PACs have changed American politics, at least at the communicative level. Now, you could argue in 2012 there was a lot of money spent, and it didn't actually move the needle all that much. I mean, the president had a kind of an interesting joke at the White House Correspondents' Dinner that Sheldon Adelson could have just offered him $100 million to get out of the race. He said he wouldn't have taken it, but he'd have thought about it. And then he looked over at the First Lady and said, Michelle would have taken it. You know. But that's a component of American politics. Those are two huge sort of meta forces. I'm just curious if you think there's any others out there that either are changing the way we communicate, changing the way the politics is practiced, and will, if you're right about gun control, change the way we talk about certain issues in different ways. And I'll start with Senator Warner, we'll go across, and then that'll wrap up this session.
I'm not sure on the kind of mechanics of politics. I'm not at all a fan. I think Citizens United was an awful decision for American democracy.
That's the Supreme Court decision
The Supreme Court decision that allowed the super PACs and unlimited
exist.
money. I think it has played more to one party's benefit, but that doesn't mean that that won't change. I just think that is not at all what the founders had in mind around the First Amendment. I guess what I would.
I mean, you've seen the Commonwealth change before your very eyes in the last decade.
Yeah, I've seen my state change. I'm saying what the founders thought about the First Amendment. But I guess what I want to take, Major, just a slight subset off of that about what I hope will change about our politics. And I didn't come to Washington naive. I'd been a governor before. I'd worked on Capitol Hill before. But I didn't appreciate till I got to Washington how much the institutional forces in Washington are all about trying to separate us into red shirt, blue shirt. Mm-hmm. And that there is no reinforcing mechanism at all, occasional editorial page, but there's no institutional support, political support, for actually finding that common ground that we all say we want to have happen, of getting to yes. One of the things that I thought was a very positive aspect on this, and we haven't, Lord knows, been as successful as I'd like on the grand bargain, which I think would actually lance the boil of some of the most vehement partisanship. Because until we get our country's balance sheet right, I'm not sure we're going to get anything else right. But was an effort put together mostly disproportionately, unfortunately, by the business community. I'd hope it had been business community plus universities plus the Cancer Society and others, where they raised about $45 million within this effort to kind of campaign to fix the debt as almost a reinforcing mechanism for people to kind of sometimes not just be red shirt, blue shirt, but actually vote interests of the country first. And my hope is, while we look at the mechanics of the politics, and I know my time's up here, which each party will use, and the influence of money, that we also think a little bit more about how we reinforce the kind of country first behavior that we all say we want, but frankly, nothing in our current political system supports.
Senator Moran.
Mark's point is a good one. I came from the state legislature where we had a common cloakroom, for example. Republicans and Democrats had a cup of coffee and a bottle of pop during the session, a soda to this crowd.
I was thinking Kansas bootleggers there for a moment.
And you come to Washington, D.C., and you have a Democrat cloakroom and a Republican cloakroom. Republicans gather for lunch twice a week ourselves. The Democrats gather for lunch among themselves. Mark is right about something we all can hope for, kind of an institutional advancement for what we all claim that we want to see happen. Almost everyone I know that's involved in politics is interested in problem solving, and we have different views of how to solve those problems, but I think there's a real desire to solve. So I wanted to comment on that as the Republican senator up here. Secondly, I think that the changes that we face in a political environment, I would point out two: demographics, changing nature of the population, who we are, where we come from, how we think, our backgrounds, and then the means of communication. Social media in particular, but the wide variety of cable news, the magnitude of the coverage, the constant attention, the effort to generate viewers, all creates a different environment. And it fits in with what this description that we just had. If a politician wants to be on the news, start a fight. Advance the negative. Say something bad about somebody. So we have a media that actually, in my view, rewards bad behavior.
Awful media.
I was going to say maybe there's only one institution less popular than the one that the the four of us represent, but that's probably
I know where
not
you're heading,
that's
Senator.
probably
Yeah,
not a
I got
valid
you on
assumption anymore either.
How would you grade Republicans on understanding demographic trends and understanding the future of communication?
I would say that electoral failures or in the last election cycles suggest we have a lot to learn.
Congresswoman? Putting it mildly, probably.
Boy, yes, lots of lessons for the Republicans from 2012, and I tend to agree.
But other forces that you think are shaping America?
Boy, other forces. Well, I
I mean,
was.
the Tea Party is a force in 2010 that delivered a majority. They're still a relevant force. They're part of a grassroots Republican activism.
Sure. When I look at 2010, I really think a lot of the pushback was more focused on healthcare reform and the way that bill had been passed through the House and the Senate, and there was this outrage and a voter turnout then that caused the Republicans to do well in 2010. But I would point to yes. Changing the way that technology is being used on campaigns. It's clear that President Obama has really taken technology to a whole new level, and the way that we communicate with citizens, engage with people on campaigns, as well as in our work. And I think it's going to be important.
How far are Republicans behind on that score? Because there was all these representations. I heard them endlessly in the last 2 or 3 weeks before the election about voter turnout and voter modeling. And when push came to shove, it wasn't there.
Right. It's clear that we were telling ourselves what we wanted to hear, and we need to be honest about where we find ourselves. And I think there's a lot of work to do for the Republicans to catch up. We historically had done very well on grassroots campaigning. We had been it was where we had dominated, and then with the advent of technology and the way to take it to a whole new level, we have not kept up. And so I think there's a lot of work to do, both in just using these tools and then using them more effectively. And we're working on that. That's a high priority for the Republicans in the House. It's certainly the way of the future. And I think it's fair to say that technology has revolutionized many other aspects of our lives, and we're seeing where it's also revolutionizing politics and campaigning and the way that we interact with citizens. And I think it actually has the potential to have a very positive impact on people being engaged in the process and having more direct communication with their representative. And then clearly the demographic changes also in the country are going to impact politics moving forward.
Senator Casey, you have the final word.
Well, first of all, I think if there's one change that has taken place the last couple of years that I see with people I represent is so many people across the ideological spectrum have become intolerant of hyperpartisanship. Maybe hasn't manifested itself in enough coming together, but I've never...
Intolerant of hyperpartisanship.
It's the number one issue. It's a bigger issue than jobs, at least in my the feedback I get. But in terms of things that will change, or forces that will be at work, Jim Messina was here, and I don't know if he's in the room, but he was here this week. I listened to him on C-SPAN one night talking about the 08 campaign versus 2012. One thing he said, which is stunning, he said, and I hope I'm remembering this right, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but he said I think he said in 2008, the Obama campaign tweeted, he said once on Election Day. He said in the 2012 campaign they had, 12 people, 15 people, 25 people just for Twitter. A whole other group just for Facebook. So all this apparatus deployed for those mediums. He said something which is stunning and I hope plays out. The television ads will take second place to those media either in 16 or 20. And that's, with all due respect to those who own television stations, that's a good thing because what's driving a lot of the division in Washington is how we finance campaigns because of time. And the reason for that are television ads, mostly. And the further away we can, or the further down we can push that as a dynamic in campaigns, I think the better.
I'm going to give you three.
Senator, just one last shot on this. This is again, because we say what demographics and tactics we're going to use, but the one thing that I would think that could be the healthiest to kind of change our political system right now is, doesn't mean anybody should give up their ideology or their strong beliefs, but we ought to not hire anybody that signs an absolutist pledge, whether it's a pledge never to touch revenues or a pledge never to touch entitlements. But if we keep hiring people who come in with their hands tied about trying to get to fixing our country's problems, then yes, it's partially our fault, but shame on you as well.
I'm going to leave you with 3 statistics that will pick up on everything that the 4 members of Congress just mentioned. One is about demographics. In 1988, Michael Dukakis lost the white vote in America by 19 percentage points, and he got 111 electoral votes against George Herbert Walker Bush. In 2012, President Obama lost the white vote by 20%, and he won 332 electoral votes. That, in a nutshell, is the changing demographics of our country, at least with an electoral college map. Lose it by 19 in 1988, get 111. Lose it by 20 in 2012, get 332. Picking up on your point about television ads, there was a survey done in October of this last campaign in Ohio and Florida. You might have read they're marginally important in presidential contests. In both states, more than 30% of those surveyed said in the previous week they had not watched any live television. Not live network television, meaning bad for me at CBS. No cable television, meaning bad for ABC and ESPN. What did they watch? They watched their streaming. They watched Hulu. They watched other platforms, Netflix, whatever.
They're older states, too, yeah.
Right. They were completely off the grid. And both campaigns had to adopt strategies to reach the off-the-gridders through Facebook, Twitter, some other means of finding a digital platform, a much less expensive platform to reach them. But a third in 2012. If you don't think those numbers are going to increase, they are going to increase. And that affects not just media, but it affects political campaign. One last statistic. I still work for National Journal. I write a column every week. In 1982, National Journal began to put together votes in Congress and then systematically place members of Congress along a broad ideological spectrum, from far left to far right. In 1982, the first year National Journal did this. In the Senate, there were 57 senators who fell between the most liberal Republican, who at the time was Lowell Weicker from Connecticut, and the most conservative Democrat, who at the time was Ed Zirinsky of Nebraska. 57 in 1982. In the House that year, there were 353. Okay, who fell between that continuum of the most liberal House Republican and the most conservative House Democrat. In 2010, there was not a single U.S. senator who fell between that spectrum, and there were 7 members of the House. Now, when these folks talk about institutional pressures and this relentless sorting, both ideologically and behaviorally, along distinctly partisan lines, that's what they're talking about. So I leave you those 3 statistics. You've been a fantastic audience. Thank you, Senator. Congressman.
Yeah, that's great.
Senator.
Thanks, Captain.
Good.